Our final day one speaker is Professor Jim McNamara, Professor of Public Communication, University of Technology in Sydney. Jim's full career details are in your delegate pack. Jim's chosen the International Summit as the place to first publicly present the findings of a 2-year global research study. And Jim will explain it for you now. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry. Thanks, Ben. I didn't need building up. Setting expectations, I think, is a thing we're supposed to do. I'm very mindful of time, so I'm going to rattle through some things fairly quickly. It is good to be back here. I noticed we were upping the game last time, and this time we're winning the game. As a statement of fact, I'm not sure I can agree with that, but as an aspiration, I think it's certainly a good statement. But in order to achieve it, I do think we need to change the game in a number of areas. So what I'm going to try and do here is inject a couple of new things and try and present 2 new ideas. One is a slightly new take on measurement. Also some new research, as Barry says. I have time just for a couple of quick examples of best practice that I've found, as well as a few sort of traditional things. A question to start with, though, and I'm not looking for some detailed academic type definition, but what do we think, what do practitioners think PR and corporate communication is? Because, and I'll answer it rhetorically for you, but if they think, but you can roll that around in your head, the people you know, the practitioners you work with, if we think it's speaking, to disseminate the messages, the voice of our organizations, if it's holding a megaphone to the mouths of CEOs and politicians, if that's what we do, if that's what we mostly conceptualize PR and corporate comms as, that's what we'll measure. And what I'll present some data to show is that's what a lot of people think it is. And so therefore, what do we measure if we think that's what it is? We measure the volume of our own voice. We measure how much stuff we put out because we're conceptualizing it as that. Conversely, if we think of communication as fundamentally speaking and listening, we will do measurement in an entirely different way. And what I'm going to present or suggest to you in really demystifying measurement is that measurement must be much more closely aligned with the second proposition, that communication is speaking and listening. If it's only associated with the first, we're in trouble. And in fact, I'd go as far as saying that measurement in many senses is simply listening. It's listening to feedback. It's listening to the response. It's listening to the voice of others instead of just measuring the volume and the reach of our own voice, which we often do. Why would I say that? I'm not going to go into any detail here, but if for one moment we stop and look at the literature, and by the way, I started by answering these questions by doing a content analysis of the literature. And that was interesting because it'll show the limitations of content analysis, because it's what people say, what they write down. Communication's about sharing meaning. It's not just about sending messages. It's transactional. If you're just transmitting information, that's information. It's speaking and listening if you look at any definition of communication. But come closer to home. And I'm going to move along quickly here because you know a lot of this stuff, but it's just this is what the literature says. This is my content analysis of 2,000 media articles and 400 books. Public relations, it's two-way. It's there in who studied public relations anywhere in their career, right? Dominant model says two-way. It's all about dialogue. It's about engagement. Oh, marketing, everybody's into engagement. It's about relationships. In fact, public relations goes as far as saying it's symmetrical. It's perfectly balanced. This is what we say. If we look at marketing communication, just in very brief, there's been a huge move over a few decades from marketing being sales transactions, one-on-one, to relationship marketing. Customer relations is a major area. Co-production, collaboration. So again, the literature seems to suggest it's about speaking and building relationships and listening. If you go to government, which we've talked a lot about this morning, governments around the world, in Europe, in the UK, in the US, very concerned to shift from this top-down information model to public consultation, to open government, which is the UK term, G2C in the US, and so forth. So this is what the content analysis tells me communication is about. So I was intrigued by this, and I set out not to actually study evaluation, I set out to study how organizations might do that two-way, not just putting out information, how information comes into an organization. And I set out, this is the findings, quick findings of a 2-year research study in 3 countries, US, UK, and Australia. It's 36 case studies. Bear in mind, this is not just government, it's government, corporate, and NGO. I did 104 interviews. I did 102 of them personally. I'll explain why there's a lot more interviews and case studies. 1,000 pages of transcripts analysed. I analysed 400 documents, 95 job descriptions, and did 25 field experiments. And those who are interested in methodology, you can have a look at why, and I'll explain briefly why I did all those different elements. Went across major centres, London City, and you heard London, New York, Washington, DC. You heard Alex this morning give me a nice little plug. But Alex was very generous in actually giving me access. It's very hard to get really clear, open, frank access into government and corporate. And Alex gave me access to a lot of government departments, but also this research comes out of Fortune 500. In fact, a couple of Fortune 50 companies, some large NGOs, some non-profits. And yes, I went to number 10. I have to put that photo in. I got into number 10. I got into the Department of Homeland Security in the US. I got into some interesting places. A purposive, very high-level sample, because it would be unfair to pick on small organisations, low-budget organisations. So I did intentionally look at large organisations, corporate government, NGO, with resources. I did in-depth interviews. So I did my content analysis of the literature, and I've already skimmed over that to say, it says we do all this two-way dialogue. That's what it says. We talk the talk. I could have done a survey. If I did a survey of all the PR organisations and corporations and NGOs out there, what would they have said if I said, do you listen and do you listen well? Yeah, we're a listening organisation. Of course they would have done. So I decided I had to do in-depth interviews, and I had to do more than one interview. And you'll see why in the data, because there's no one site of listening. I couldn't just look at PR or corporate comms. I actually looked at research. I looked at insights. I looked at digital and social media. I looked at customer relations. I looked at public consultation teams. I looked at marketing comms. So I ended up doing 7 and 8 interviews in most of these organizations. But that wasn't enough. Anyone who told me something, and here's a research methodology of triangulation, I didn't believe them, because I'm an academic, see, and I don't believe anybody. So anytime someone said they did something, I had to see evidence. If they said they did public consultation, I need to see the public consultation documents. If they said they'd run focus groups, even if I can't publish it, I need to see it. Otherwise, it's not in the data set. So I'm verifying the data. But I did a third thing, and here's a lesson in triangulation. Without any of these organizations knowing, I had a team of colleagues who were submitting real-life inquiries, complaints, comments into their websites, their social media, even a few letters. We were actually testing how they responded. So without them knowing, we were getting actual empirical data. What did we find? My little graphic that's in the research report, and the bit that you didn't say, I think, is that the research report is available to all registered delegates. So I'm doing a very quick skim over, but a full 75-page report is available to you, which I'm happy to share. My little cartoon, listening is about like 2 cans, but even the bit of string is broken. Key findings, as I mentioned already, there's multiple sites of this two-way communication. It's not restricted to PR and corporate comms, so I looked at a number of these disciplinary areas. Even looking at all those disciplinary areas, what we call, and when I say organisation communication, I'm using all of those disciplines. Organisation public communication is overwhelmingly broadcasting information and transmitting information. It's speaking in simple terms. It's all about distributing the messages of the organisation. When I looked on average, and this is by the agreement of the participants, when I asked them the percentage of all your time, your resources, your people, your technologies, and your budgets, what percentage is spent on speaking type activities versus listening type activities? The average was 80% speaking. Average. That included public consultation that's meant to be almost entirely listening. So not surprisingly, up to 95% of the so-called communication of some organisations is simply putting out stuff. Now, to me, that's a fundamental problem in communication, but it's also a real problem for evaluation, because those organisations will clearly only evaluate what they're putting out and how much they put out. 5 to 20% is spent on members listening of any kind. It didn't have to be called listening. It could be called insights, research, customer feedback, or whatever. Very sadly, and I'll get probably things thrown at me in some other audiences on this one, the fields of practice that most explicitly claim to do dialogue, engagement, two-way communication, fields like public relations, actually did the least listening. In fact, in some areas, I couldn't find any evidence of incoming information or listening at all. Who does the most listening, you're probably asking, so I'll just share. I'm only sharing a few of the findings here. I put elected representatives at the top, but with a question mark. I looked at the organisation, the internals of the organisation, but I accept that field staff and elected representatives would do a lot of listening. But putting them to the side, the most listening happens in customer relations, digital and social media, research and insights. I started to think, measurement itself is a form of listening. Public consultation teams, government communication generally, although bear in mind government includes digital and social and research, etc. Internal organisation comms, corporate communication and trailing up the field, well, not quite. Actually, marketing communication, apart from customer relations, never got onto the chart because it does market research, but that's sort of usually once a year or once every few years. But even though there was some really good listening, and there was some really interesting findings in here, a lot of it, even when listening was done, it was done for what I describe as instrumental purposes. It was done to identify targets. It was done to do research such as, we want to find out, would you like widgets in blue, yellow, or green? There was no opportunity to say, we don't actually want widgets, we actually want something else. So it'll ring a bell with you. A lot of surveys, a lot of research is extremely narrow to ask set questions that the organisation wants to know, not necessarily to let people say what they want to say. So it was quite narrow. And then the other big problem was that listening when it was done was often not articulated. I found sites of excellence done by practitioners, but it never travelled through to decision makers. There was various barriers along the way. Just to give you one quote from the literature, and I'm picking on public relations again, this is from a leading PR textbook, and it's the only one I could find with the word listening anywhere in it. Listening gives a foundation for knowing what to say and thinking strategically the best ways to frame and present appealing messages. That sort of, okay, that's fine, we do need to know that, but is that the scope, is that the totality of what an organisation should listen for? Cutting towards the conclusions of it, what I've come up with is an argument that if we are doing communication, whatever it's called, public communication, corporate communication, we really have, what the data shows is that what we do, what we call communication, is the construction of an architecture for speaking for the organisation. We build not we necessarily in this room, but practitioners build quite a sophisticated architecture of technologies, tools, people, training, skills, etc. What we need to also have is an architecture of listening. These are outlined examples in the report, so I don't have time to go through them here, but it starts with culture. And you'll see how this tracks onto measurement in a moment. I'll close the loop back. But there absolutely has to be a culture of listening or a culture of measurement, or it won't happen. There's got to be policies. There's got to be addressing of the politics. Who do we listen to, etc. There's got to be structures and systems. There's got to be technologies come into it, but the reason I'm emphasising this architecture is there's a tendency to think, oh, we need to do a bit of research, a bit of listening. Oh, we need to do a bit of measurement, same thing. Let's find a tool and just add it on. Bolt on a tool and we're all fixed. And what I found is any time an organisation, and I looked at a lot, had done that, had brought in a technology but hadn't addressed culture, didn't have policies, didn't have systems, didn't have procedures, it didn't work. These other things had to be in place, and then the tools and the clever technologies. So some of you make clever technologies. If they are not working and not getting the sort of ultimate results you want, it may be because of some of these things like culture and policies and internal systems and structures are not in place. They need resources. Clearly they need skills, and this is why, again, without the skills to read the dashboards, interpret the dashboards. I saw one impressive case where the agency was actually going in and training the client, training them how to read the dashboards, because it turned out they didn't have a clue. They were not getting the information out of it, as well as training our own people. And the eighth element of listening is this articulation of what we do hear, what we do find through listening or research, articulating it to management. Now, what I found in reflecting on this data, and I'm skimming through it quickly, is that actually an architecture of listening maps to me, almost exactly onto what could be called an architecture of measurement. Because it made me think that, because when I found excellent research, which was one of the sites of listening I was looking at, I found that there was a culture, either driven by evangelists in the organization or CEOs that understood it and were driving it. There were policies. The politics of listening was, and when you might say, what are the politics of measurement? Well, silos would be an example where data is siloed and people are fighting each other. Structures and systems, technologies, resources, skills, and articulation. Now, it might sound like a lot, but to me, I think we spent a lot of time, and I've been to a lot of summits. I was one of the earliest summits in that other big landmass across the Atlantic when they started summits, and we've talked forever about better tools, better technologies. And when I've been studying listening and all the different ways organizations listening, it's really struck me that it's actually about we've got to build a culture, we've got to build these policies, we've got to have systems, resources, etc. I'm going to very quickly show you just a couple of just a few examples out of the study because I have very limited time. One negative, one positive. It really disturbed me and worried me that social media, I thought, would be one of the really outstanding sites of listening where you can look in 24/7. What I found is about 80% of organizations use social media purely for tracking their own likes and their own follows, their own voice. That's all they use it for. Complete, utter waste of this resource. There were exceptions. I don't know if Mark Wiener's still in the room, but he can get a plug. MasterCard was one of the few companies that allowed me to name them because they're fairly proud of this. But Alex mentioned this morning about we need to go digital with dashboards. And MasterCard certainly have. They've built a very, very sophisticated electronic dashboard. In fact, one of them's the size of this entire wall in all of their head offices, but also modules on every PC of every senior manager in the organization. And whether they want it or not, they get data and qualitative and quantitative on their desktop every day. It includes lots of lovely charts and graphs, but also qualitative information. They actually get feeds of leading posts and leading tweets, and they get flagged by the agency, Prime Research, if they think the agency thinks this needed to be responded to or needs to be addressed. But I found that an example of, and it is a fairly expensive undertaking, it was one of the more sophisticated. There were 3 other organizations I found similar, very, very sophisticated dashboards. Still used a lot for the organization's benefit, a lot of targeting, a lot of identifying of influencers. But in that organization, it doesn't seem to me that you can escape hearing the voice of your stakeholders. They seem to be coming through very, very clearly. And so is that listening? Yes. Is it measurement? Yes. To me, this is where the research studies seem to start to collide. This is not the prettiest chart. Oh, there's Elaine, I can see her there. This is not the prettiest chart, but I put it up for one reason. It's an example of a dashboard. It's inside the UK government. I have got a laser pointer here. But what's interesting, as well as charts and tables, 2 features of this chart. CCU is Customer Contact Unit. And stakeholders said, and this is an example of starting to combine graphics, numbers, impressions, etc., but also some real-life data of what the customer contact. So here's reaching outside the silo. This is not just done by comm staff. They're reaching out to customer relations and pulling in data. They're going out to stakeholder survey data and pulling that in. And it's only one example, but there can be so much more of that sort of work done. Another quick example that I've seen that I like is reaching out to spot on, Ben, steal. But not so steal, beg, borrow, steal if you have to. There's so much data out there, and the UK government, again, makes a lot of use of third-party data like the British Social Attitude Study, as well as their own RepTrack studies. It disappoints me greatly as an academic these days that very few people ever ask for our data. And as academics, we're already paid for by the taxpayer, so we're pretty happy to give it away. And usually, hardly anybody asks to work with 2 of my 36 case studies worked with any academic. I thought, what's wrong with this industry? We're here, we're free half the time, we'll charge you sometimes, but we're often available to advise, etc. And you did notice in Alex Aiken's work, extensive use of pulling in academics. He's getting people to work for him. I want to finish with one quick case study that I thought was, to me, this blew my mind a little bit, and it wasn't a communication person in sight. In the UK, 5.5 million outpatient appointments are missed every year. People just don't turn up. Now, that's been going on for years. And there's a big comms department, etc. Why is that a problem? It costs someone's worked out in the National Audit Office, £225 million a year, because they are paying a lot of people on contract rates to turn up, be in surgeries, and people don't show. $225 million, there's a problem. Two young 25-year-old behavioural psychologists, call it Behavioural Insights, Behavioural Economics is a similar firm, similar terms. These two guys come in and go, oh, that's a bit of a problem, I wonder what we could do about that. So they run 2 randomised controlled trials, fairly sophisticated research, measurement, but they test, first of all, what sort of reminders might work. Phoning people, writing them letters, what will work, or SMS text messages. They find out very quickly that a simple SMS text message the day before reduces the rate of missed appointments and saves money. They don't stop there. They then say, well, what type of SMS message? Because they come at it from a different point of view. The PR and advertising industry would hire the creatives, and they would design something off their brilliant brain straight away into the creativity that may or may not work. These guys said, we don't have a clue. We're not into it. We'll find out. We listen first. So they go out and they test multiple types of text messages, and they start to find out that personalising the language brings the rate down. Then they start to find out that conformity messages, like suggesting that other people are towing the line, brings the rate down. They then make 2 more major breakthroughs, and they find out that putting in a dollar figure, a pound figure in this case, and they calculated that every missed appointment cost every taxpayer cost taxpayers 160 pounds, I should say, every individual one. So they put in a message, every missed appointment costs you, the British taxpayer, 160 pounds. And the rate starts to plunge down. They go further and find by putting a simple interactive phone number where you click on a message and it rings a phone and say push 1 for cancel, push 2 for confirm, in total reduces it from 11.1 to 8.4%. This is all done in about 7 months by these 2 25-year-old behavioural psychologists. Except that means 45 to 50 million pounds of savings. Now, I call that an ROI. Why couldn't comms people see these issues? And it just seemed to me, and I'll be honest, I think if I was a comms person there 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have seen it either. And so it seems to me that reaching out into other disciplines, another health organisation in the UK did a similar thing, testing organ donation messages, a really tricky thing to get people to give organ donation. 96,000 extra registrations in the first year. Conclusions, I'll wrap up. Listening fundamentally is a missing corollary in communication. You can't do communication actually without listening. Listening matters because it's central to engagement. You can't actually engage with people if you're not listening to them, and it's damn certain they won't engage with you or an organisation if we're not listening to them. Listening has been shown in research to be fundamental to satisfaction, to trust, to relationships. And listening, of course, is fundamental to intelligence and insights. So to me, if we see communication as creating an architecture of speaking, which I'm conjecturing is what the PR and advertising and marketing communication, corporate communication has basically done over the many decades, what happens then is communication often fails, and we primarily measure the volume and the reach of our own voice. But if we approach communication from the perspective of creating and deploying an architecture of listening as well as an architecture of speaking, two breakthroughs occur. Firstly, the communication is far more likely to be effective, just like the case of the 2 young behavioural insights people, and we have a constant flow of information back into our organisation. To me, to be effective and to do better at measurement and evaluation, we need to do less talking and more listening. Thank you.
Say that. Thanks, Jim. And thanks for sharing that with us for the first time publicly. And Jim was right to remind me, I hadn't said that that report will be available only to Summit accredited delegates.
There is going to be a book. You can buy the book,
yeah.
But the report's free.
Who has the first question for Jim?
I did my
Okay,
best to end
wait
at
for the
5:30.
microphone, please.
Hi, it's Alistair Wheat from Gorkana. Very interested in the social listening piece of it, and I just wondered what your thoughts were on the challenges in getting to audiences that maybe are not using social, and how social can potentially also distort the findings because it's not necessarily a representative group.
It's a good question. There's no really one way to listen. Unfortunately, there's not. There's multiple sites of listening in organisations. Social is an easy one because it's relatively inexpensive. The sample is not valid for a start. We need to understand the limitations of social, but it's there. People are having those conversations and speaking about many, many issues all of the time. So it makes sense to do that. There are many audiences that are not only not digital, but even things like public consultation. In my report, I've written a lot about even public consultation doesn't listen very well, because what they do is they call for submissions. Who writes submissions? Professional PR people and lawyers and big organisations by and large. And yet if you go out and do outreach and go out and actually door knock, go out and do a pop-up consultation in a shopping centre, which I've done, you find exactly the opposite sometimes of what the big organisations are saying. So there's, as brief as I can answer it, social is a very, very simple and easy part of the equation. It is not the total answer. Sometimes you will need statistically valid research. Other times you will need outreach into marginalised communities, remote communities. But given that social is there and the conversation is happening all of the time, it just seems crazy to me that we don't access that. But we do accept a lot of limitations of it.
I'd like to ask, I'd like to ask you if you could confirm my impression that what you wish would be to have more qualitative data and depending on qualitative data. And the second thing would be to have more input analysis and optimizing what you do rather than only checking what came out. My name is Nanette Besson from Germany.
I read your PhD, I think. Yes, I definitely always advocate, and I did last year at the summit, advocate more qualitative research because quantitative is important. We've got no choice. Numbers are necessary for management, for business these days. They tell you some important things, but they don't, when you get into issues of why, when you get into issues of what's the cause of this and how do people really feel. If I did this study, as I was trying to indicate, if I did this quantitatively, I don't think I'd give you anything of great use. Because I would have told you everyone says they're a great organisation. They do piles of listening, and look how many inquiries. You know, the average government department handles 70,000 letters a year. I could have all these great numbers, but to me, they don't tell me what's really going on. Overall, my concern is that communication, what the fields of communication are not doing the communication. They're not doing the two-way. And I said in the Evaluation Council just after lunch that what I see happening is the most exciting work is coming out of behavioural scientists, behavioural insights, behavioural economics, neuroscience, government public consultation people sometimes, knowledge management experts, not the old 1980s style, but sort of the new age of knowledge management where they talk about human senses, providing them with information. These are all neighbouring disciplines that I think we could partner with and work with, but I think if we don't, I'll be blunt and say they're going to take the turf that this conference is talking about. They will take the turf.
Thank you, Jim.